In today's show of Connections, we will be talking about how radical rocks led the way for radical behaviorism. So the first part of our journey takes us here to the Chugach Mountains near Anchorage, Alaska. And people began to wonder how these spectacular geological formations were created. How long have they been there? What were the processes responsible for their creation? The prevailing theories of the time were called catastrophism. And in this idea, they believed that the geological formations of the Earth were all a product of these large, sudden, catastrophic events. So an example would be from the story of Noah's Ark, how the world was flooded and this large, sudden disaster shaped out, eroded the mountain faces and created what they are today. So the next part of our trip takes us to Edinburgh, Scotland, where the next important figure in our story was born. In 1727, James Hutton was born to a wealthy family. He originally studied to be a doctor. He completed his dissertation in the circulation of blood in the human body, but quickly he realized that he did not want to spend the rest of his time being a doctor. So he moves back to a plot of land that his family owned and decides to become a farmer. But not only a farmer, but an entrepreneur. And as he lived the rest of his life, he began to become curious about the geological formations. How did they get there? Why were they there? What were the processes responsible for them? And here in this picture, this was the backyard of Hutton. Basically, these are the Salisbury Crags, cliff face, very near where he grew up. And he began to toy with the idea that maybe these rocks were being continually created and destroyed somewhere within the Earth. But at this point, it was just an idea based on some of the observations that he has done. So him and his friend, John Playfair, set out from Edinburgh, Scotland to a coast in Berwickshire called Sychar's Point. And here, what they observe is something that we today call an angular unconformity. And I'd like to draw y'all's attention to the two different directions of the layers within these rock formations. So this bottom layer is something called greywacke. And you see that the layers seem to be pointing in a vertical direction. The top layer is a layer of sandstone. And you see that these layers seem to be heading in a horizontal direction. So this was really puzzling to both the researchers. And then they developed an idea. What if the geological formations of the Earth weren't due to large catastrophic events, but rather a product of small gradual changes that accumulated to form these geological structures over extremely long periods of time? And this really got the ball rolling in terms of our understanding of modern geology. So James Hutton takes his observations and writes it in a book titled The Theory of Earth. However, as you can imagine, this idea was not very popular. It wasn't widely accepted because it went against the prevailing theories of the time, and it also kind of seemed to go against what the biblical stories suggested as far as the formation of the Earth. So his friend, John Playfair, who has been on Hutton's side the entire time of the inception of these ideas, suggests that maybe people weren't just understanding what James Hutton was trying to say. So he writes his own book where he takes Hutton's ideas and translates them into very general and plain terms, and includes his own ideas and illustrations in support of what he calls the Hutonian theory of the Earth. So our next trip takes us from the Sychar's Point to the Kinnordy Estates, where the next important player in the history of geology was born. In this house, Charles Lyell was born in the late 1700s. And he too was interested in why geological formations existed. How did they get there, right? These same questions about geology. He primarily studied volcanic activity and after reading the work by James Hutton and John Playfair, he came to very similar conclusions. So he writes a book titled The Principles of Geology. He credits James Hutton as the father of modern geology and creates a theory called uniformitarianism. And uniformitarianism contains two key ideas that are important for the rest of this story. The two ideas were that, one, if we want to understand process that occurred in the past, we can look at the processes occurring now. The processes occurring now are very likely the same ones that have occurred in the distant past. The second thing is that geological formations are more likely due to small, gradual changes over long periods of time, and those changes accumulate to create what we see today. And here we are at the inception of what's called modern geology. And we see how these ideas created a shift in our approach to understanding geological formations. And we see that it's pretty close to our current understanding of geology. So now, the next part of our trip takes us from Scotland to a small island off the coast of Ecuador known as the Galapagos Islands, where a guy was on a boat. This boat's name was the HMS Beagle, and in this boat was none other than Charles Darwin. Well, Charles Darwin was largely influenced by Charles Lyell and his book, Principles of Geology. He actually had it on board with him as he set out to make his observations on the HMS Beagle. And through those ideas of uniformitarianism, he really started to play with the idea that small gradual changes could accumulate to create what we see now. And with that in mind, and his observations, he developed the theory of evolution by natural selection. And he proposed this idea of biological continuity. So me, a human being, a monkey, and a rat were somehow distantly related, right? We weren't beings created by some godly figure. Rather, we were a product of this natural selection. And this idea of biological continuity kind of suggested that there was not only biological continuity, but something that could be called psychological continuity. So what that meant was that maybe the learning processes occurring in lower organisms were the same processes occurring for the learning of humans. So an example of this was the comparative psychology studies of the time. Here we have Willard Small in 1901 who started experimenting with rats in using an apparatus of a maze. And although him and along with other comparative psychologists were interested in inferring those inner mental processes occurring within the organism, I suggest that this was the biggest shift in the paradigm of psychological research. Instead of trying to dig deep into the organism, if you just look at it from a third-person point of view, they were really just studying environment-behavior relations and the changes thereof over time. So this next part of our journey takes us from the Galapagos Islands to the University of Chicago, where these two figures were the dominant researchers in the field of psychology. They were categorized into the field of functionalism. On the left, you see John Dewey, and on the right, you see J.R. Engel. And these functionalists had a student by the name of John B. Watson. Watson was trained in the same methods that functionalists were. And functionalists were heavily inspired by the theory of by the idea of biological continuity and the theory of evolution by natural selection. And then John B. Watson, along with his experimental procedures developed by Ivan Pavlov and respondent conditioning, starts to change the question. He sees the people studying rats in mazes and says, why don't we just look at the behavior? The behavior, environment relations are what's observable to everyone. And that is the realm of an objective science of behavior. And then this last part of our trip will take us from the University of Chicago to Harvard University, where none other than B.F. Skinner was, this was his home in academia. And he, in response to methodological behaviorism and the modern prevailing theories of the time, wrote a paper titled The Operational Analysis of Psychological Terms. And note that B.F. Skinner was initially a researcher in respondent conditioning, but his own journey to understand the behavior of organisms kind of led the way to his discovery of operant conditioning and his general approach to the understanding of human behavior and behavior of all organisms. So in this paper, he suggests that it's in contrast to Watson, that it's the important question is not that whether states of consciousness and these psychological events exist, but he asked what are the conditions under which that we learn to talk about these mental processes? What is the role of the verbal community in teaching us what we know about ourself? And this brings us to the end of our journey. And as we have seen how the inception or the creation of modern geology have led the way to our understanding of radical behaviorism. These processes may not be causal, but we start to see how small changes, again occurring over time, start to snowball and produce bigger changes down the line.